Hello, everyone. Paul Elam here with An Ear for Men. Before I get started today, I want to offer a word of sincere thanks to those who recently made Patreon pledges and one-time donations to An Ear for Men in our drive. Your support is great encouragement for me to continue this work. Today's talk is about romantic love, or rather the image of it that is embedded in modern cultural consciousness. It's an important topic to consider because the romantic love narrative affects every man, gay or straight, married or single, red pill or blue pill in this society. Though it may seem like a strange path to get to my conclusions, I want to start by talking about the difference between Americans and Canadians. Despite being adjacent to each other on the same continent, sharing the same language and nearly identical European roots, we are very different in many cultural and political ways. At least part of this goes back to historical events that shaped each country respectively. Almost 250 years ago, America rebelled from the control of the British Crown and fought a war for its independence. At the same time, Canada remained loyal to the monarchy. America became symbolic of freedom across the world and spawned generations of revolutionary thinkers, inventors, and scientists. It also became a culture marred by violence, crime, and civil war, deeply divided along racial and other lines. Meanwhile, Canada emerged as a comparatively peaceful nation, with fewer worries about violent crime than many Americans can even imagine. It is also a nation generally more comfortable with government control, conformity, and less likely to be innovative than its neighbor to the south. One nation exalts fierce individualism and personal liberty. The other is more passionate about what is perceived as the greater good and the collective comfort of all. While these are generalizations with abundant exceptions, I think they will be apparent to most people as accurate. The purpose of the observations is not to compare the relative quality of either country, but to demonstrate the unconscious influence of history on any society. It is to take note of how culture is shaped, how attitudes and perspectives are molded by events over a prolonged period of time. You can see this across the world, in the East and the West, in Western European nations and countries that once lived under the tyranny of communism. Each culture has its own definitive story, a narrative that lives in the mind of each person in the form of stories and their associated iconic imagery. Whether reacting to that imagery with rebellion, compliance, or a combination of the two, no one gets to escape the influence of the narrative. Historical events shape all of us in one way or another. As I have mentioned in other videos on this channel, one such historical event is romantic love, the normalized, unhealthy Western trend to follow the irrational, emotional, and sexual compulsions that come with infatuation in the pursuit of a happily ever after fantasy outcome in marriage. The allure and power of such a model is so tempting that we see many people charmed into the pursuit of it despite overwhelming evidence that it's a bad idea. We know, with a simple and honest examination of the historical record, that marriage, without significant, even overbearing social pressure on people to stay together, simply falls apart. And that in the modern climate, it falls apart badly. We know this from the incidence of divorce and from the long-term misery index of many who don't divorce. There are some exceptions. People who stay married long enough to overcome the power struggles that romantic love fosters once infatuation fades sometimes manage to reach a state of mature love and mutual affection late in life. This is probably something that happened much more often when marriages were arranged and when, for other reasons, people felt compelled to avoid divorce. In fact, an analysis of Western and Eastern marriages that was published in the Journal of Comparative Family Studies yielded very interesting results. The article, How Love Emerges in Arranged Marriages, Two Cross-Cultural Studies by Robert Epstein, Mayuri Pandit, and Mansi Thakkar, 2013, reached past the obvious superiority of arranged marriages in terms of the incidence of divorce and into the area of relationship quality based on love. As is quoted from the abstract, the fact that love can grow in some arranged marriages and that this process can apparently be analyzed and understood scientifically raises the possibility that practices that are used to strengthen love in arranged marriages could be introduced into autonomous marriages in Western cultures where love normally weakens over time. The study authors attribute the increase in love to commitment and sacrifice for the relationship, but I think this is only part of the explanation. The social pressure to continue arranged marriages is likely what contributes to creating an environment where perseverance and sacrifice are possible, thus being credited with the growth of love. Now, I'm certainly not recommending arranged marriage, or any other marriage for that matter. The current legal climate in the West makes any marriage a foolish move. I'm simply pointing out that arranged marriages are far less likely to end in divorce and more likely to result in mature love than marriages based on infatuation and romance. That seems to be, at this point, a near scientific certainty. That is information that any man can and should consider when either considering a long-term relationship or considering why he might avoid one. Western marriage is a crumbling institution because there are no social pressures to keep it together once the illusion of romance fades and yields to reality. Those pressures ended when feminism obliterated the social stigma of divorce by getting laws changed and by lauding a lack of commitment and untrustworthy qualities in women. That was relatively easy to accomplish with the help of gynocentric men because romantic relationships were unstable to begin with. Romantic love, as we know it today, isn't even a human instinct or a product of our evolution. Its emergence was a historical event, a manufactured and marketed alternative model to traditional arranged marriages that became a remarkably resilient social trend. That started, as far as we can tell from the historical record, in the mid-12th century with the emergence of a rebellion against the stability of arranged marriages. Prior to popularizing the idea that infatuation and lust should result in marriage, an idea in hindsight that is quite insane, such practices were deeply frowned on as a mark of foolishness. Married couples could and did go through life perfectly well without it. Author Robert Johnson writes about marriage in India, recounting a Hindu marriage rite in which the bride and groom make the solemn but hopeful statement, "You will be my best friend." Johnson goes further, saying, and I quote, "In a traditional Hindu marriage, a man's commitment to his wife does not depend on his staying in love with her. Since he was never in love in the first place, there is no way he can fall out of love. His relationship to his wife is based on loving her, not being in love with the ideal he projects onto her. His relationship is not going to collapse because one day he falls out of love or because he meets another woman who catches his projection. He is committed to a woman and a family, not to a projection." Unquote. That is from Understanding the Psychology of Romantic Love, HarperCollins, 1983. Arranged marriages sometimes, maybe often, resulted in great fondness between husband and wife. Many may have reached a state of mature love that can only happen with years of coexistence as life partners, but they did not start as two people head over heels in love. They often started as two people who had never even seen each other. They had one other characteristic that makes those marriages decidedly different than modern unions in the West. By and large, they worked. Divorces were and are comparatively rare, not because couples were in love and inseparable, but just for the opposite reason. They worked because the marriage was not in service to the fantasy of sustained romantic love. Couples in arranged marriages were committed to building love in their relationship, which paradoxically led to feeling they had more control over love and relationships. This is in contrast to romantic lovers who complain of being tossed around on the waves of love with little or no control over any of it. Romantic love is ultimately a toxic agent that was allowed to overtake the institution of marriage, partly because of the human weakness for self-indulgence and in large part because of cultural gynocentrism. Embracing lust, infatuation, and the chemically charged highs that come with it in a society that overvalues women is as easy as selling drugs. And we see the result of that today in what happens to most marriages based on transient emotions once social mores about divorce are removed. They fail like subprime loans. We can even see the quickly mounting damage to marriage in Eastern culture that has accompanied the importation of Western values. The impact is a dramatic reflection of what has been happening for the past 50 years in Western culture. Till then, in the West, we had managed to keep social pressures on marriage in a way that kept couples together. At my age, I remember days when people literally whispered about divorces because they were such a sensitive subject. Those days have passed, and divorce is not only no longer taboo, it is the expected outcome of most marriages, spawning entire industries in the legal, social work, and domestic violence fields. The setup for all this misery can be traced through the narrative of our past, through the imagery of romantic love that has infected human consciousness and now drives Western men to confusion and ultimately to ruin. Most men, however, aren't comfortable too long in the skin of a victim, even when they have been victims in the truest sense of the word. When men are up against a brick wall, most tend to find a way out. We see the attempts to react and create a new narrative emerging, especially on the internet. It is precisely the reverse of the revisionist feminist narrative about the sexes, casting women as slaves, chattel in a world run by and for men. Men, at least some of them, have begun to pen a story about freedom, self-awareness, and self-responsibility. The challenge to our failed script is a simple one. Are we willing to adopt a new one? Well, can an American man move to Canada or Mexico and adopt the local story as his own? Can an Australian man move to America and do the same thing? Sure they can. It happens all the time. All it takes is the willingness and the courage to embrace a different narrative, a different history of yourself, one that does not hinge on the insane pursuit of false love and dangerously conditional approval. There's not a man listening to this anywhere that cannot make that story unfold. The only question is whether he will or won't. Okay, guys, time for some Monday myth busting here at An Ear for Men. Today's myth is that love is something that happens between two people and that is maintained and improved upon in the relationship afterward. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Love between a man and a woman, if it ever happens at all, is something that is grown over a very long period of time. It is nearly impossible for that to happen with a woman when the state and the society she lives in motivate her to end things at your expense. If you fall in love with a woman and want to marry her, you are living by a script that has nothing but your service and utility in mind. I urge you in the strongest of terms to dedicate your efforts towards smashing any notion of romantic infatuation. If you are inclined to pursue long-term relationships, Much better to focus on whether or not you like a woman than whether you love her and whether you have any real reason to like her to begin with. Always, always, always jealously protect your legal vulnerabilities. Always put your freedom and self-respect ahead of her romantic satisfaction. If you want to love anything, love yourself and your values. If any kind of meaningful love with your woman is ever going to happen, it will only be as it always has, after a long time spent together learning how to love each other. Ignoring that knowledge is a mandate for your personal destruction. Well, that's it for another Talk at an Ear for Men. As always, please like and share these videos and sub to the channel to help us spread the word. If you want to support the work being produced here, there's a link in the low bar to the Patreon page. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed today's talk, even if you haven't, and we'll see you next time.